I am a soldier and have always been one of those who do not believe in stories or legends. My thing is the facts, the tangible. My life has been a constant confrontation with danger, and I have seen things that would make any civilian tremble. But nothing prepared me for what happened in that cursed desert when I faced something that escaped all logic, something that should not exist. It was a routine mission. My battalion and I had been detached in an arid and desolate area in the north of the country, a place where the heat seemed to devour the flesh and the night swallowed the soul. It was a hostile territory, but not for what we expected, because the enemy was not human. We had arrived to investigate the disappearances of several military groups in the area. There were no combat officers or confrontations, only the disturbing silence of soldiers who never returned. Trained men hardened by war evaporating into nothing. That set off the alarms, and no one would admit it. But there was a rumor that ran through the squadrons, a kind of somber whisper that terrified the veterans. They said that in those lands, there was no conventional enemy because there was something that hunted, something ancient and relentless. Some called it the skin thief. The base that was assigned to us was in ruins. There were nothing but vestiges of what was once an active military post. Abandoned buildings, wrecked vehicles, and the worst, stench. The air was impregnated with an acrid smell, as if something rotten had been fermenting for years under the relentless sun. We did not see bodies or human remains, but there was something in the environment that made my hair stand on end. Something was wrong. That first night, I could not sleep because I was in bed wrapped in a darkness so dense that it could almost be cut. The wind blew softly but brought with it a strange sound, as if someone or something was whispering in the distance, too far to understand the words but close enough to disturb me. I attributed it to tiredness, the stress of being in such a hostile area, and forced myself to close my eyes. But something kept me alert, a premonition, a sensation in my chest that did not let me be at peace. It was then that I heard it for the first time, a low and guttural growl that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. I got up and left the store with the rifle in hand, looking for something, anything, that justified that feeling. The air was thick, and the silence almost unbearable, but I saw nothing, only shadows that lengthened under the moonlight. The rest of the companions slept, or at least they tried to. I decided it would be better not to alarm them with my paranoia, so I went back to my bed. But that night, I could not sleep because something was out there. I knew it. The next day passed without much news, but the tension in the air was palpable, because we all knew that something was not right. We continued exploring the terrain, looking for signs of the missing soldiers, but we found nothing. Only old traces of empty camps and rusty tools. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the men. When night fell, the fear intensified, and we took turns to stand guard. When it was my turn, the sounds returned. First, those distant grunts that seemed to come from the ground, as if something large was moving beneath us. Then the wind changed and stopped being a warm breeze and became a cutting cold, bringing with it a new sound, the creaking sound of something walking among the dead trees. I stood in my tracks, my gun in position, trying to identify the origin of that noise, and it was then when I saw him for the first time. A tall figure, too tall to be a man, moved through the shadows a few meters away. His walk was clumsy, as if he didn't know how to use his legs. But what terrified me the most was his shape, because he seemed human, but he wasn't. The skin he wore hung from his body in an unnatural way, as if it didn't belong to him, as if it had been torn from another being. Then I felt a knot in my stomach because that wasn't possible, it couldn't be real. I stood still, waiting for him to disappear, but then he stopped, turned his head in my direction, and at that moment, I knew I was there. I could feel his gaze piercing the darkness, and my heart raced, and fear invaded me in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't the common fear of a soldier in combat. It was something primitive, an ancestral fear because I was facing something I didn't understand, something that didn't belong to this world. I ran to the tent, waking up my companions, but when I told them what I had seen, they attributed it to fatigue, the days of tension. However, I could see in their eyes that something worried them too. Maybe they had already felt the same but did not want to admit it. That night, we were all more alert because the atmosphere was suffocating. and the feeling of being watched never left us. And the smell, that smell of rotten flesh to death, grew stronger and stronger. Something was there, and it was fast, brutal. In the middle of the guard of one of the companions, the silence was broken with a heartbreaking scream. We ran towards the place, but it was too late because his body lay on the ground stripped of its skin. His face was frozen in a grimace of indescribable terror, but the worst was what we did not see. There was no trace of the attacker, not even signs of struggle. He had simply been skinned alive in a matter of seconds. The panic took over the group. We tried to communicate with the main base, but the radios did not work, as if something was interfering with the signals. We were alone, trapped with that which stalked us, and there was no escape. That same night, I saw him again, closer this time. He walked around our camp, watching us, and his skin was stretched out tensely, and her walk was still erratic, almost as if he was learning to move in that body that didn't belong to him. The truth is, I can't describe the horror of that moment because we didn't know what to do, and the bullets didn't seem to make sense in the face of something like that. We began to lose men one after another, and every time someone moved away, even for a second, we heard their scream, and then there was only silence and a skinned corpse. He was relentless, patient, and in no hurry. He was just hunting us one by one. The days went by, and we were few, and fear had become our only company. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was in whispers because we didn't want him to know we were still there, although deep down we knew he knew. He was playing with us like a cat plays with a mouse before devouring it. Finally, we decided that we had to escape, although we had no idea how to do it without being seen. One night, we took advantage of a sandstorm to move, and we thought that the wind and the sand would cover us, but we were wrong. In the middle of the storm, we saw him walking between the gusts of sand as if they didn't affect him, and his enormous and disfigured silhouette was the only thing I distinguished. In that, we ran. We ran like we had never done before, but it was in vain. The last thing I remember from that night is the sound of my companions falling one after another while I kept running. The wind drowned their screams, but I felt it. I knew there was no one else left, and I kept running until my legs couldn't take it anymore, and I fell to the ground, exhausted, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. When I woke up, I was alone. There was no trace of my companions or of what had married them. Well, somehow I had survived. They found me days later, wandering through the desert in a state of shock. I could barely tell what happened, but no one believed me. They attributed it to trauma or mental fatigue, but I know what I saw. I know what married us, and it wasn't human. It wasn't something that belonged to this world. Since then, I haven't been able to sleep well, and every time I close my eyes, I see that figure moving in the shadows, getting closer, little by little. I know it's still there, waiting, and someday it will come for me because that's what it is. And when it finds you, it takes your skin. I never went back to that cursed desert, but I hear rumors of more disappearances. I am a former soldier of the United States, and although it has been almost 40 years, there is something that haunts me every night, something that prevents me from sleeping and that I will never be able to erase from my mind. It all began in 1986 during a military operation that, until today, I have not managed to fully understand. We were sent to a remote place deep in the jungle to guard an ancient indigenous cemetery. I still remember how that order sounded, to guard a simple term but loaded with a weight that none of us anticipated. That mission was different from the beginning. I felt it, and I was not the only one. The land where the cemetery was located was surrounded by stories, tales that the elders of the place shared with whispers, always avoiding speaking out loud, as if they were afraid that someone or something could hear them. At first, like every good soldier, I did not give it too much importance. I thought it was about local superstitions, but as we approached, something in the air changed. We were a small detachment of 6 trained men hardened in war, but the tension in the air was felt from the moment we crossed the first line of trees that marked the edge of the cemetery. It was not a normal cemetery. There were no tombstones or crosses, only mounds of earth piled unevenly and covered by a dense layer of vegetation. Some of the mounds seemed to be centuries old, while others looked newly removed, as if someone or something had been digging recently. The first night, we set up our camp in a clearing near the cemetery. We had not brought tents because we did not think we would be there longer than necessary. The mission was simple: patrol, guard, and wait for instructions. That was the theory, but the reality was very different. From the first moment that darkness fell, everything began to feel wrong. It was a darkness that seemed much heavier than usual, enveloping the place like an oppressive blanket. The only sound was the whispering of the trees moved by a freezing breeze that did not seem natural for the time of year. And then the chants began. At first, we heard them in the distance, as if they came from the other side of the jungle. They were barely perceptible, a murmur that floated in the air, echoing between the trees and the graves. I don't know, it seemed like nothing I had ever heard before. They weren't religious chants or prayers or anything that could be associated with the human. They were more like a lament, an ancient and painful echo. No one said anything, but in the faces of my companions, I could see the same terror that was beginning to invade my insides. That first night, we didn't sleep. The tension kept us alert, our eyes fixed on the darkness. Hours passed, and the murmur faded until finally, just before dawn, everything fell silent. It was a crushing silence, more disturbing than any other sound. The next day, we were all exhausted. We tried to distract ourselves with our tasks, check our equipment, walk the perimeter, but nothing could shake that feeling that something was deeply wrong in that place. None of us said it out loud, but it was evident that we all felt the same. As evening fell, the atmosphere became even more oppressive. The graves seemed to move slightly with each breeze that passed. One of my companions, a young soldier named Rodriguez, began to get nervous. "It's just the wind," I told myself. However, I couldn't stop watching him. That light movement in the ground as if something or someone was underneath, pushing to get out. That night, the chants returned, this time closer. I could hear the words, or what seemed like words, but I didn't understand a single one. They sounded ancient from another time. I got up from my improvised bed and took my rifle. The others did the same in complete silence. The full moon illuminated the cemetery, and the shadows of the graves lengthened grotesquely. Then I saw him. It was a man, or at least it seemed like it. He was covered in mud from head to toe, standing in front of one of the graves. He was thin, almost skeletal, and he didn't move. His skin, or what seemed to be his skin, was cracked like dry earth after a long drought. A smell of wet earth and something else, something rotten, invaded the air. I felt the impulse to get closer, but something inside me screamed at me not to do it. I ignored the instinct, took a step forward, and the mud man simply vanished into the air. There was no sound or movement, nothing. Only the cold sensation of something watching me, something that did not belong to this world. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time in years, I felt fear, a primitive one that I didn't know even on the battlefield. I didn't want to talk about what I saw with the others. I was afraid that by putting it into words, it would become more real. But I wasn't the only one who had a strange experience that night. Martinez, one of the veterans of the group, told us with his eyes sunken from lack of sleep that he heard whispers right behind him while he was making his rounds. There was no one when he turned around, but he swore he heard a voice calling his name. We began to talk about withdrawing to ask for a new assignment, but we knew we couldn't. The orders were clear. We couldn't leave our position until we were told to. As time went on, the feeling of being watched became unbearable, and the chants, those damn chants, now echoed inside my head even during the day. Fear turned to paranoia. On that third night, the cemetery seemed to come to life. The graves were really moving. It wasn't the wind this time. We saw them open and close as if something was breathing underneath. It was as if the souls of the dead were trying to get out, as if the same cemetery was cursed. And then the worst of all happened. Rodriguez disappeared. He had gone out to patrol the perimeter like we did every night. The night was darker than usual, even though there were no clouds in the sky. It was about 20 minutes before we realized he hadn't returned. We went to look for him, but all we found was his rifle lying on the ground right next to one of the recently moved graves. There was no sign of him, as if the earth had devoured him. Panic took hold of us. We tried to call by radio for reinforcements, but there was no answer. We were alone, trapped in that damn place. The last night was hell. The cemetery, if it could still be called that, writhed beneath our feet. Mud emanated from the graves, and mud-covered figures emerged from the darkness, moving between the mounds like wandering shadows. We couldn't shoot them. Every time we aimed, they disappeared as if they were just illusions, but the cold they left behind was too real. At dawn, there were only 3 of us left. Rodriguez never appeared, and Martins, weakened by fear and fatigue, committed suicide with his own gun before daylight could come. We finally got out of the place and never spoke of what happened again. Official reports mention communication failures and the disappearance of a soldier. But we know the truth. Sometimes, in my worst nightmares, I see that cemetery again and smell the wet earth. I don't know what we found there, but I know it didn't belong to this world. And now, many years later, I can still hear those damn chants. When I close my eyes, I can still see the figures emerging from the mud. And I know that whatever it was, it's still there, waiting for the next unwary souls to guard its cursed grounds. It was the year 1978. The dictatorship in the United States had taken us to participate in a mission that, in theory, shouldn't last more than a few days. We were a small group of soldiers, tough men, hardened by the cold of the mountains. But that winter in the mountains of the north, El Kima had decided to give us a different test. For 3 days, an incessant storm trapped us on the slopes of those hills. Nobody talked much about what we were doing there, but we knew that we were in hostile terrain. Terrain that was not made for us. The snow fell with a violence that I had rarely seen. The wind trampled at night, and its whistling crept in our improvised shelters, almost as if the mountain itself was mocking us. We had enough to eat, although the cold made everything seem little. The coffee I boiled in our thermos barely managed to warm our numb hands. It was beginning to weigh on us, and some of us no longer knew if the creaking we heard at night was the ice moving or something else. On the 4th day, the storm finally began to give way. The gray sky barely let in a weak ray of light, but that small window gave us hope that we would soon be able to get out of that frozen hell. The commander had been in contact with the base through the radio, and rescue was supposed to arrive at any moment. We just had to hold on a little longer. But then the unthinkable happened. In our unit, there was a soldier named Ramirez. He was young, one of the new ones, but he had that air of invincibility that we all lose sooner or later. He had been strange since we arrived at the mountain, quieter than usual. I noticed it because we used to talk a lot during guard duty. At some point, he stopped making eye contact with any of us, and his answers became short, almost monotonous. I thought maybe it was the cold or the isolation, things that can wear out even the best. But it wasn't that. There was something else. That morning, one of the soldiers raised the alarm. Ramirez was not in his sleeping bag. His rifle and equipment were still there, but he was not. The first thing we thought was that he had gone out to urinate and that perhaps he had become disoriented in the snow. But the storm had already stopped. There was no reason why he hadn't returned. We organized a small search around, hoping that we would find him soon. As we walked among the rocks, I felt a weight on my chest, a strange sensation that could not be explained only by the cold. Finally, we found him. He was standing on the edge of a cliff. The snow surrounded him, but he seemed oblivious to everything, as if he didn't even feel the ice under his boots. His gaze was lost in the immensity of the void. My soldier instincts told me that something was not right, and I ordered the others not to get too close. We called him, we shouted his name, but he didn't respond. When I finally decided to approach, just to try to reason with him, it was when I heard it. One laugh at first, low like a whisper, but then it got louder. It wasn't a normal laugh. There was something in that sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It seemed to come from deep within his throat, but at the same time, it didn't seem like his. It was as if the mountain itself was laughing through him. I instinctively stepped back, feeling that something horrible was about to happen. The others looked frozen in place, unable to understand what they were seeing. Ramirez kept laughing, and then, in a movement that seemed too fluid for someone in his state, he jumped into the void. He didn't try to save himself. He didn't scream. He just disappeared between the rocks and the snow, as if the mountain had claimed him. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. No one moved for what seemed like an eternity, and when we finally did, it was only to step back away from that precipice, as if we were somehow avoiding falling. We also knew that his body was down there, shattered between the stones, but no one wanted to go look for him. The radio kept emitting static. The rescue hadn't arrived, and we stayed in that place, trapped with a shadow that was no longer he would leave us alone. For the next few hours, something began to change in the group. The faces of my companions became paler, more tense. No one wanted to talk about what we had seen, but it was obvious that we all felt it. Something was not right in that place. Ramirez's laughter kept echoing in my head, and although I tried to get it out, I couldn't. At night, when it was my turn to go on guard, I felt that I was not alone. The wind no longer howled like before. Now it whispered. It was a soft, constant sound, and at first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I listened to it, the more convinced I became that those murmurs were not natural. Every time I turned my head, I had the sensation that something was watching me from the darkness. I felt a weight in the air, an invisible presence that seemed to move just out of my sight. Even the cold had changed. It was no longer simply icy. It was oppressive, as if the mountain was trying to absorb all the heat that I had left. I wondered if there was something in that mountain that was affecting us, something ancient, older than any of us, and much more dangerous. The commander had told us that the area was full of indigenous stories, legends about spirits and creatures that lived in the mountains, but at the time we had taken it as superstition. Now, I was not so sure. The next morning, another of the soldiers, Perez, began to behave strangely. He was shivering, although the cold had not worsened. His eyes seemed empty, and he muttered unintelligible things. We tried to get some coherent word out of him, but he only repeated that something was watching us, that they were coming for us. He did not explain who they were, but his voice, full of an inexplicable fear, remained engraved in my mind. During that afternoon, stranger things began to happen. The radio stopped working, the compasses spun out of control, and some of the men claimed to have seen shadows between the trees, moving fast, too fast. At first, I attributed it to tiredness, but it did not take long for me to notice that I also saw those dark shapes that seemed to watch, hiding just at the limits of our vision. The last day before the rescue arrived was the worst. The whispers were no longer just noise in my head. They were words, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once, talking to me, laughing, calling my name. I could feel my sanity beginning to slip away from me, as if every minute I spent in that place tore a little more of myself away from me. I realized that it wasn't just Ramirez who had fallen under the influence of whatever lived on that mountain. We were all being married in some way. Finally, at noon, the helicopter arrived. When I saw the rotor lifting the snow and heard the deafening noise of the propellers, it was as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. We left quickly, almost without looking back, leaving Ramirez's body among the rocks, buried in the snow and the mystery. No one spoke in the helicopter on the way back. No one wanted to admit what we had seen or, worse yet, what we had felt. I have never been a person who believed in legends. During my years in the army, I have lived through things that could scare many, but in the end, everything had a rational explanation. That is what I believed until they sent us to that Sierra, a mountainous region in the north of the country, a forgotten place where the very clouds seem to hide the sun forever. What I experienced there is something that I will never be able to forget, something that haunts me every time I close my eyes. That mission marked a before and after in my life, and even today, although I try to leave it behind, the nightmares come back again and again. This story is my attempt to get it out of me, as if writing it could make it disappear from my mind. We had been given clear orders to secure the area and locate a group of smugglers who, according to intelligence, were using the region to hide. It was the first weeks of autumn when the Sierra began to freeze at night. We went out as a group of 5. Sergeant Munoz, Corporal Ribas, Soldiers Perez, Ortega, and we were warned at the barracks of the inclement weather, but none mentioned what was really lurking in that mountain. The first day in the Sierra was quiet, too quiet. The vegetation was thick, and despite the fact that we carried a map and compasses, the terrain was difficult to navigate. At midday, the sky had completely covered, and the temperature dropped rapidly. There was no sign of the smugglers nor traces of any recent human activity. Something did not fit. As night fell, we set up an improvised camp with the hope that the next day we would find some clue. That first night was when everything began to feel strange. The wind howled through the trees, but it did so in a way that did not seem natural. It was not the typical sound of the wind through the branches, but something deeper, as if the forest itself was moaning in pain. Perez was the first to mention it. "Do you hear that?" he asked, with his gaze fixed on the darkness. At first, I thought he was just getting carried away by the atmosphere of the place, but soon I realized that we were all listening to him. It was like a distant lament, something that seemed to come from deep within the Sierra. Nobody said anything else. We just stayed in silence, tense, until finally tiredness overcame us. The second day was worse. The fog appeared early, enveloping everything in a dense and humid layer. We could barely see a few meters in front of us. We continued walking, guided only by our compasses, but the feeling of being lost was undeniable. Munoz, who had always been the most determined, began to doubt our route. We tried to stay together, but the fog played tricks on our minds. Sometimes, I felt that there was something moving between the trees, shadows that disappeared when I looked at them directly. "We are not alone here," Ortega murmured, looking towards the thicket. We ignored it, or rather, we tried to ignore it, but as the day progressed, the feeling that something was stalking us grew stronger. Then what happened broke what little remained of our calm. We found a corpse. It was half hidden in the undergrowth, with his hands twisted in impossible angles, as if he had fought something before he died. His face, God! His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, but that wasn't the worst. His body was partially devoured, as if something large and strong had torn him apart. No, he looked like an animal. The marks on the skin were precise, almost human. Munoz knelt next to the body, trying to identify the man, but his uniform had no visible insignia. As he examined him, the wind blew again, bringing with it that same lament from the night before, but now stronger, closer. "We're leaving," said the sergeant, his voice tense. "This is not what we expected. We tried to go back, but everything in the mountains seemed to conspire against us." We walked in circles, each step more desperate than the last. The fog grew thicker, and the sun, if it had ever risen, was no longer visible. The third day, Ortega disappeared. We were moving slowly when suddenly he was no longer with us. We heard nothing, not a scream or the cracking of branches. He simply vanished. We searched for hours, shouting his name, but the mountains swallowed our screams without returning any echo. The night fell quickly, and with it, the true nightmare began. As we tried to light a fire to keep the cold at bay, we heard something moving through the trees. It was a heavy sound, a crunching of branches and leaves that indicated that something somewhat large was lurking nearby. We immediately got up, weapons ready, but we could not see anything beyond the fog. And then we saw it. I do not know how to describe it without it sounding crazy. It was a tall, thin figure with very long arms that hung from its body as if it had no bones. Its eyes shone in the darkness, two red dots that seemed to observe us with a mixture of hunger and contempt. It had a kind of horns or twisted stalks emerging from its head, and its skin was pale, almost translucent. When I saw it for the first time, I thought I was hallucinating, but the panic in the eyes of my companions confirmed to me that it was not the only one. "Fire!" shouted Munoz, and we all fired at once, but it was useless. The creature did not seem affected. It moved with impossible speed, disappearing between the trees before we could aim correctly. But it didn't go away. We knew it was getting closer. Rivas began to lose his mind. I saw him talking to himself, mumbling things without shadows, following him, calling him by his name. The next morning, we found him dead, hanging from a tree with his own rope. There were no signs of a fight. He had simply given up. By then, there were only 3 of us left. Munoz, Perez, and I, desperate. We decided to abandon everything and try to leave the Sierra on foot, without following any fixed course, just moving away from that area. But no matter how much we walked, Munoz and we knew that it wouldn't take long to follow the same destiny. It was that night when I saw him again. He was closer now, close enough to see the details of his face, or what should be a face, because what was in front of us was not human. His mouth was huge, full of sharp teeth, and a nauseating smell emanated from his body, like rotten meat. Munoz opened fire again, but I knew it was useless. It was no use. The creature attacked him before he could react. I saw him fall to the ground, torn apart, while that being devoured his flesh with a ferocity that I have not seen, not even in the most savage animals. I don't know how I managed to run, how I could stay alive, but I ran, without looking back, without knowing where, just hoping that that monster wouldn't follow me. I don't know how many days I wandered through the mountains, but in the end, they found me, dehydrated, on the verge of death. When I returned to the barracks, nobody believed me. They said it was the stress, that the mountains can play tricks on the mind. But I know what I saw. I can't forget those red eyes, that hunger insatiable. The Wendigo, as some call it, is still there in the mountains, waiting for its next prey. And every night in my dreams, I can feel its cold breath on the back of my neck, waiting for the moment to claim me, because I know I didn't really escape. No one escapes from the Wendigo. My name is Julio Salazar. In 1989, I was deployed as part of a military squadron on a reconnaissance mission in El Salvador, in the middle of the Civil War. It was a time of chaos and violence, but we were no strangers to brutality. I had fought in other conflicts, and I thought that, as always, the horrors would be raw and tangible, human. I didn't imagine that when stepping on fear would take a much more deep and dark turn. We were sent to a remote village in the mountains. Officially, we were going to look for guerrilla presence, but deep down, we knew it was an excuse to strengthen control over the region. The villagers were poor peasants who barely sustained themselves with what they grew. But in their eyes, there was something that bothered me from the first day. It was not just fear. It was as if they knew something that we did not. One of the oldest approached the first night we arrived. He was a hunched man with a face carved by the years and work under the sun. With a trembling voice, he warned us that we were in a place where soldiers should not be, where the dead walked, and where the land was for those who carried weapons. My companions, like me, laughed. It seemed like one of those stories that people tell to scare the forums to keep us away. But the feeling of uneasiness began almost immediately. The first night while I stood guard, the dogs of the village began to howl for no apparent reason. There was no moon, and the sky was absolute darkness. My rifle hung at my side as I looked out at the forest that surrounded the village, trying to ignore the shiver running down my spine. Suddenly, the radio on my belt crackled, and a voice filtered through the headphones. At first, I thought it was one of my companions, but the words made no sense. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, an ancient and guttural tongue. The strange thing is that the channel was closed. No one should have been able to transmit. I tried to make contact with the rest of the squad, but the signal was dead. Only the murmur of that distant voice remained, seeming to surround me from the darkness of the forest. The next day, I shared what happened, but everyone dismissed it. The radio equipment is defective, Torres told me, the group's technician. I didn't think about it anymore. However, the atmosphere in the village did not improve. The looks of the villagers continued to be a mixture of contempt and pity. They were hiding something. That same week, while we were setting up a surveillance network around the perimeter, the accidents began. The first was Mendez. We found him in the morning after he did not respond to the call for breakfast. He was lying in his tent, rigid, with his eyes wide open. His face was deformed by an expression of pure terror, and on his skin, there was a strange pallor that we had never seen before. The platoon doctors could not explain it. There were no signs of violence or visible wounds. Heart attack, they finally concluded, although Mendez had no history of heart problems. Mendez's death left a void in the group, but the greatest impact came when 2 days later, Gomez, another of my companions, disappeared without a trace. He went on a night patrol and never returned. At first, we thought he had deserted or had gotten lost in the bush, but what we found made any hope fade. The next day, we found his corpse hanging from a tree in the forest, a few meters from where he had been patrolling. His body was in a deplorable state, as if it had been mutilated by some wild animal. But there was something that did not fit. His face had the same expression of terror as Mendez, and his hands were rigid, pointing towards the village. Fear began to spread through the camp. Some spoke of guerrillas ambushing, but something else deep had sunk into our hearts. The deaths had no logic, and the nights kept bringing new horrors. The dogs kept howling, the radios kept transmitting those strange voices, and everyone in the squadron began to see things in the darkness. Shadows that slipped between the trees, figures that seemed to observe us from a distance. Torres, always the most rational of the group, was the next to die. They found him in his tent, soaked in sweat, with his face buried in his hands. His fingers were clenched, as if he had tried to tear out his eyes. The official explanation was stress-induced paranoia, but we all knew it was more than that. Something was playing with our minds, something that silently stalked us. It was after Torres' death when I began to have dreams. They were not the usual nightmares, but visions. In them, I found myself alone in the middle of the village, but the village was not empty. In each of the huts, there were soldiers, men from different eras, all uniformed, with pale faces and empty eyes. They looked at me from the windows, from the doors, as if waiting for me to join them. Every time I woke up, I felt that a part of me had been trapped in that dream, a pair that I would never recover. The villagers began to avoid us completely. They no longer left their houses. When we passed, only the old man who had warned us at the beginning continued to watch us, always from a distance, with a look of resignation, as if he knew that we were already lost. The last days before the evacuation were the worst. There were 6 of us at the beginning, but only 3 remained. Each of us lived in constant fear of being next. The nights were endless, full of murmurs that came from nowhere, of footsteps that had no owner. There were nights when we couldn't even sleep. We sat in a circle with our weapons in hand, waiting for the final blow. I remember the last night with a terrifying clarity. We were ready to retreat, but something in the environment had changed. The air was heavy, suffocating. We took refuge in one of the abandoned houses of the village, trembling, hoping that the light of day would bring us some kind of salvation, but salvation never came. In the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. The howling of the dogs had ceased, and the silence was absolute. Suddenly, the radios began to crackle again, this time with more force. The voices were clearer but still incomprehensible. I sat up, soaked in sweat, and then I saw it from one of the windows, a figure watching. It was a man dressed in an old uniform, very similar to ours, but his face was covered in shadows, and his eyes were completely black. I tried to move, scream, but my body was paralyzed by terror. The figure raised a hand as if it were calling me. Around me, my companions began to murmur in their dreams, their bodies writhing in an unnatural way, as if something invisible was manipulating them. The figure approached the door, and it was then when everything faded into a deep, suffocating darkness. I woke up at dawn, only to find my companions had disappeared, and there was no trace of them. The radios were off, the dogs were dead, and the village was completely empty. I walked for hours until I was finally found by another squad. They could never explain what happened in that village. The deaths were classified as combat accidents, but I knew the truth. That land was as the old man had warned. The spirits of the fallen soldiers, those who had stepped on those lands before us, had claimed my comrades one by one. Now, even in the safety of the barracks, I feel their presence in the shadows, in the whispers of the wind. I know that one day they will come for me too. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear the crackle of radios and voices, the same ones I heard in the village. It was 1967, a routine mission in the jungle of southern Chile. I was a private part of an army reconnaissance unit, but that day marked my life in a way that I will never be able to forget. If someone had warned me what would happen in that place, I would have deserted without thinking twice. But who would have believed it? How could we imagine that the darkness that awaited us was not human? We were not prepared for what was to come. Our platoon was assigned to patrol a remote region near a mountainous border, known for its dense vegetation and treacherous terrain. The objective was clear: to explore the area to make sure there was no illegal smuggling activity or paramilitary movements. But from the beginning, everything felt different. The first warning came from old Sergeant Ortega, a man hardened by more than 25 years in the army. Someone who sometimes showed emotions while checking the maps before leaving. I saw him observing the terrain with a mixture of concern and fear. He approached me silently and whispered, almost as if he didn't want the others to hear him. This place is not like the others. There are stories that the locals tell about Cerro Malalo. We shouldn't go there. I looked at him strangely. Ortega was never one to believe in legends or superstition, but there was something in his gaze that made me deeply uncomfortable. However, orders were orders, and we had to move. The first day in the jungle was exhausting, although apparently normal. We advanced with difficulty through the dense undergrowth, the slippery ground covered with rotten leaves that gave off a nauseating smell. As the sun set, a blanket of absolute darkness took over the place, and with it, the silence. Not even the sound of nocturnal animals seemed to break that oppressive calm. That night, we established a temporary camp on the edge of a ravine. The humidity was suffocating, and the heat was unbearable. The environment felt thick, as if the air itself enveloped us in a kind of invisible suffocation. Despite the tiredness, it was difficult for me to sleep. I felt a growing restlessness, as if something or someone was watching us from the shadows of the jungle. In the middle of the night, I woke up startled by a strange noise, a whisper that seemed to move between the trees. I could not identify if it came from the wind or from something else. I remained motionless with the rifle at my side, sharpening my hearing. Then I heard it again. It was like a murmur, but not in Spanish. They seemed like ancient, cultural words mixed with the sound of the branches moving. I looked around and noticed that I was not the only one who had heard it. Ortega was awake, with my eyes wide open and my jaw tense. She slowly rose and approached me. "It's her, the witch of Malalo," she barely whispered. The next day, the atmosphere between us was tense, as if we all knew something, although none of us knew it. Not a single bird or insect, just our creaking footsteps and the heavy breathing of the men. It was as if something, a presence, had taken all life out of the place. By the third night, things began to spiral out of control. One of our companions, Corporal Ramirez, began to behave strangely. He said he saw shadows moving through the trees, figures that watched him from the edge of our vision, always lurking, always silent. At first, we thought he was hallucinating from exhaustion, but soon others began to say the same thing. I myself saw something that night, a tall, hunched shadow that slid through the trees at an impossible speed. It made no noise, but every time I saw it, a wave of cold ran down my spine. The situation worsened when Ortega fell ill. It seemed like a simple cold at first, but his condition worsened rapidly. He began to rave, saying incomprehensible things. The most terrifying thing was that in his fever, he repeated over and over again the witch's name, as if he was talking to her directly. That night, while the others tried to rest, I stayed by her side. At one point, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone so weakened. "She watches us, she's close," she told me with glassy eyes. "She wants us to leave or to stay forever." I couldn't answer her. The truth was that I also felt that something was stalking us, something much more dangerous than wild animals or the rebels we were looking for. That night, Ortega died. I had never seen a man die that way. His skin turned gray, as if he had been drained of all his blood, and his expression froze in a rictus of pure terror. The platoon doctors couldn't explain it. They simply said it had been an infection, but no one believed it. The day after his death was the breaking point. We decided to abandon the mission and return to the base, but no matter how much we walked, the terrain became more difficult, the shadows in the jungle more threatening, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Then the worst happened. One afternoon, while we were crossing a narrow stream, we heard a heart-rending scream. One of the Figueroa soldiers had disappeared. In the middle of the group, everything happened in seconds. I saw him standing at the edge of the stream, and then, as if something had pulled him with an inhuman force, he simply disappeared into the darkness of the vegetation. We could not find him. We only heard his screams that vanished into the air. We tried to follow his trail, but it was useless. We were trapped. There was no other word to describe it. The jungle had closed our way, and each attempt to get out only took us deeper into that green hell. The following nights were the worst of my life. The whispers came back stronger, and the shadows seemed to get closer and closer. One morning, while I was watching the camp, I saw something that I will never forget. In the dim light of a moon hidden among the clouds, I saw a figure standing just a few meters from me. It was a woman, or at least that's what it seemed. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair fell in long and tangled locks. Her eyes were two empty black wells. She did not make a sound, but I saw her raise a hand and point at me. At that moment, an indescribable cold ran through my entire body, paralyzing me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just watched her motionless until she disappeared in the fog. The next morning, I decided that it didn't matter what the others said. I would leave there. I preferred to face a court-martial than to stay in that cursed place. Along with two companions, we tried to take a different path, but as evening fell, we arrived at the same place where we had started. It was as if the jungle itself was mocking us. Finally, after what seemed like eternal days, we found a rescue group. We had been missing longer than we thought. They told us that we had been almost 2 weeks without communication, when for us it had been just a few days. Only 5 of the 12 who entered the jungle came out alive. We never found the bodies of the others. The official investigation concluded that the terrain and extreme weather conditions had been responsible for the deaths and disappearances. But those of us who survived know the truth. It was not the climate or the jungle. It was her, the witch. Since then, I have not slept well. Some nights, in the quiet of my house, I swear I can hear those whispers, and sometimes, in the darkness, I feel their gaze waiting, watching like it did. In the jungle, within the barracks of Bogota, I will leave my name anonymous. Not only out of caution, but for something deeper. I don't want to relive what happened, or for my words to bring with them the same fate that affected my companions. I was part of the U.S. Army, and during my training at the Bogota base, something happened. Something that will haunt me until my last breath. I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy, but I will try to do it in as much detail as possible. It is possible that when reading this, you feel a sensation of discomfort. If so, I recommend that you stop reading. Not everyone can endure what I lived through. The barracks had its history, like all places where tears and sweat have been shed. High walls, high ceilings, and long rows of metal beds, in which recruits spent the nights between strenuous exercises and shouted orders. There was always time to talk about what ran through the shadows of the place. I was not interested. I did not believe in those things, ghost stories of figures that appeared at night. They were just legends to scare the newest one. One of those rumors, however, was more persistent than the rest. Everyone knew it, the legend of the woman in white. They said that she had been the wife of an officer who died under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Some assured that they had found her floating in the river near the barracks. Others that she simply disappeared one day. Her spirit, according to what they said, appeared at the foot of the beds, watching in silence, waiting for something. But nobody ever said what. I remember the first time I heard that story. We were sitting in the mess hall, about to finish our lunch, when a veteran began to talk about her. It was an especially dark night, one of those that make the wind sound like a cursed whisper between the windows. We laughed as we always did, discarding it. I told myself that it was just another silly thing. My life in the army continued as usual until that night. It is ironic that I remember it so clearly because it should not have been different than any other. We were exhausted after a day of maneuvers in the rain. The cold had settled in our bones, and all I wanted was to sleep and forget about the pain in my muscles. I entered the barracks and fell on the bed. A short time later, I sank into a deep sleep. Then something changed. I woke up suddenly, although I didn't know why at first. The air felt different, heavier, and there was a strange, almost supernatural cold that invaded the room. I covered myself with the blanket, thinking that perhaps a window had opened. But the air was not the kind of cold that comes from a draft. It was another kind of cold, one that is felt on the skin but also in the soul. I tried to move, but I couldn't. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. My muscles were too tired to respond. But soon, I realized that it wasn't just that. Something, a presence, kept me nailed to the mattress. My breathing accelerated, and my eyes moved frantically, searching in the darkness. And there I saw her. At the foot of my bed, barely visible in the gloom, was a silent, motionless figure, pale as the moonlight. She was a tall, thin woman in a white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her hair fell messily over her face, and although I couldn't see her eyes, I knew that she was staring at me. I could feel her gaze burning me, cold and empty. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of my throat. I was completely paralyzed, trapped by an invisible force. And then, in that terrifying silence, I heard something. It was a sound, low like a whisper, but at the same time it was like it echoed throughout the room. It said my name. It didn't ask. It didn't scream. It simply said it in a tone so soft it seemed like the walls were absorbing it. I felt my skin prickling. Every fiber of my being wanted to run away, but I couldn't move. I could only stare at it, that spectral figure, while her pale lips kept moving, murmuring something I couldn't fully understand. The figure stood there for what seemed like hours. My eyes were beginning to burn from not blinking. My chest ached from the desperation of not being able to breathe deeply. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, I was left alone in the darkness, panting as if I had run for miles. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for that thing to come back. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream, a kind of sleep paralysis caused by exhaustion. But something inside me knew it wasn't like that. The feeling, that cold, those invisible eyes that looked at me were too real to be just a product of my mind. I was not the only one. After a few days, another companion mentioned that he had had a strange experience. His story was almost identical to mine. The same figure, the same cold, the same whisper. We decided not to talk about it anymore, but we knew that something was happening, and we were not prepared for what would come next. 3 weeks later, during one of the night maneuvers, one of the recruits disappeared. Nobody understood how it had happened. We had seen him minutes before, but suddenly he was simply no longer there. We searched for him for hours but did not find a clue. The next day, his body appeared in the same river that bordered the barracks. They found him floating face down, pale as the moon, with his eyes open in a state of pure terror. That was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, another companion died. This time, they found her in her bunk, completely rigid, as if she had died of a heart attack. But there was no medical explanation for her condition. Only her face marked by an expression that I will never forget, a grimace of absolute terror, as if she had seen something she shouldn't have. After that death, the atmosphere in the barracks changed. The fear was palpable. Nobody talked about it, but we all knew what was happening. The rumor of the woman in white was no longer a legend. It was real, and it was claiming victims. I survived, but not without consequences. Since that night, my dreams were invaded by horrible nightmares, always with the same figure watching me from the darkest corner of the room, whispering my name over and over again. I woke up sweating, with my heart about to explode, and every time I did, I felt that she was closer, as if each whisper brought her a little closer to me. I asked for my transfer. Shortly after the third death, I could not stand any more nights in that place. They told me it was because of stress that I needed to rest. I did not tell them the truth. I did not even try to explain to them what had happened. They would not have believed it. Now, years later, I still have the same nightmares. I keep waking up in the middle of the night, feeling that cold. Sometimes, I think I see her, just a white flash in the darkness of my room. I never dare look directly. I feel like if I do, if I let myself see her again, this time I won't survive. And if you're reading this, I warn you, don't look for her. Don't try to understand what she really is. Because once you see her, once you hear your name in her whisper, you will be marked. And no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, she will always find you. It was the year 1988 when I was sent to a military base in the mountains of Uguay. The place was remote, lonely, and colder than one would expect for that region. The air had a strange weight, as if something invisible contaminated it. From the beginning, everything seemed strange to me. The behavior of the officers, the constant silence that enveloped the camp, and above all, the stories that ran among the soldiers. One soldier in particular, Carrizo, had been the last to do the night round. His face had changed drastically since he arrived at the base. I remember him as a robust guy, sure of himself, but in the days leading up to his death, I saw him wither. His skin was pale, his eyes were red, and he spoke in whispers, as if he was afraid that something or someone was listening to him. The few times I spoke to him, he avoided the subject of the night watch. He said that the mountain wind played with the mind, that sometimes he heard voices or saw shadows that shouldn't be there. It was an especially cold night when everything fell apart. Carrizo went out to do his guard as always, but that morning he returned early. I saw him when he entered the barracks. He seemed to be in a trance, barely standing. A group of us surrounded him, trying to get some information out of him, but the only thing that came out of his mouth was an understandable murmur. He seemed possessed by terror. A couple of hours later, they found him hanged in his quarters. He left a note written in a shaky handwriting, in which he described having seen it all. What disturbed me most was the clarity with which he described the figure, horns that mixed with the darkness, bright eyes that followed him relentlessly, and a presence that, according to his words, was consuming him from inside. Since then, nobody wanted to stand guard in that place. The command forced us to continue with the routine, but the atmosphere in the base became oppressive. Every time the sun set, a feeling of collective anxiety took hold of us. There was something in the darkness of those mountains that did not leave us in peace. It seemed that the silence of the night was loaded with invisible presences. The shadows seemed to lengthen, and the wind, instead of a whisper, brought with it a feeling of surveillance. It was not just paranoia, we all felt it. Nobody spoke openly about it, but the glances between the soldiers said it all. We were all trapped in a cycle of terror that we could not understand. A couple of weeks after Carrizo's death, they assigned me to the night guard. I took it as a test of resistance. Even so, there was a part of me that could not avoid feeling a visceral fear. The note that Carrizo left would not leave my mind. What had he seen? What had taken away his sanity in a matter of hours? That night, I put on my uniform with trembling hands. The others barely looked me in the eyes. They knew that I had no other option than to comply with the order. But deep down, I think everyone expected not to see me enter through the door again the next morning. They handed me a rifle, although at that moment, it seemed more like a useless toy than a tool of protection. When I left the barracks, the cold hit me immediately, but it was not just the physical cold. There was something in the air, a kind of latent presence, as if something was waiting. The moon was low, hidden behind thick clouds, which made the darkness even more intense. I advanced along the perimeter of the base, following the path that others had taken before me. The wind crept through the nearby trees, and on more than one occasion, I thought I heard whispers. But it was not the common wind. It was more personal, as if someone was talking right behind me. At first, I tried to rationalize the stress, the tension, the accumulated fatigue, anything that would help me maintain my composure. But the more time passed, the clearer the feeling became that I was not alone. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned sharply, aiming with the rifle, but there was nobody. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. It was telling me, however, that those steps were not imaginary. They were real. I could feel it. I continued with the round, but my heart was beating strongly. On more than one occasion, I thought I saw shadows moving between the trees. I stopped, breathed, and repeated to myself that they were only illusions caused by the low light. But something was wrong. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the air had become dense, and each breath hurt. Around 3 in the morning, something changed. It was as if the air itself had stopped. Everything became silent, but not the kind of silence that is felt when the wind stops. It was an oppressive silence, as if the whole world had stopped breathing. The cold sweat began to run down my back, and then I saw it in the shadows a few meters away. Something moved. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But as it approached, I knew it was nothing that I could classify as something natural. It was more than 2 meters tall, with a grotesque silhouette. Its skin seemed to absorb the light, a blackness so intense it almost hurt to look at it. And then I saw its eyes, shining not with a warm flash, but with a cold light, almost unnatural. It looked at me, or at least it seemed that way, although it had no face. Only that absolute darkness, and behind that figure, I could make out horns protruding from its head, mixing with the shadows of the trees. Panic took hold of me. I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were nailed to the ground. The air around me became denser, as if something invisible was pressing on me. Couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. All I could do was watch as that thing slowly approached, each step resonating in my mind like an endless echo. At that moment, I understood what had happened with Carrizo. That thing not only scared you, it invaded you, consumed you. I felt like its presence was getting into my mind, digging into my worst fears, bringing out the darkest memories. I don't know how much time passed, but when I could finally move, I ran. I ran without looking back, without thinking about anything other than fleeing from that entity. When I got to the barracks, I was soaked in sweat. I could barely breathe. The others looked at me with a mixture of pity and horror. They knew what I had seen. No one said anything. I collapsed in my bunk, shaking like a leaf. That was the last time I did night watch. The base closed a few weeks later, although we were never told why. The rumors continued, but no one wanted to delve into them. Some said it was an ancient curse. Others spoke of rituals that were done in those mountains long before we arrived. But for me, the explanation no longer mattered. What I had seen that night had no name or logic. It was pure evil. To this day, I still dream of those bright eyes, with that figure that watches me from the shadows. And although I try to tell myself that it was a hallucination, deep down I know the truth. What I saw in those mountains will be real and is still there, waiting for its next victim. I have never felt safe in the darkness again. In 1980, I found myself in the Sonoran desert, where the stifling heat was something I remember as if I had never been able to escape from that place, not even in my dreams. We were in the middle of a military operation that, at its core, seemed simple. Routine patrols securing a passage area and little else. But that superficial calm always got tangled up in something deeper when you went into the desert landscape. Infinity of dunes and open skies. There was something disturbing, something ancient and dark, as if there were secrets buried under the sand, waiting to be unearthed by those who had the misfortune of stepping on the wrong ground. We were a group of 6 men, each with his own load of scars and experiences, but nothing we had lived through had prepared us for what happened to Juan Galvez, one of the youngest soldiers in our group. Sometimes I think that experience is a shield, and Galvez, although he was skilled and brave, did not have that shield. He was always curious, as if he wanted to see beyond what he was taught, and it was that curiosity that led him straight to his demise. It all began when we met that old woman in the middle of the desert. We had set up a small temporary camp while we waited for instructions, and Galvez had gone out to explore the surroundings, as he usually did. It was strange to see a person in such a desolate area, much less an old woman. But there she was, at the edge of a small hill of rocks, covered with a shawl of colors, her bare feet on the burning sand. She said she was a healer, but her eyes had a deep blackness, as if they hid centuries of hatred and pain. The old woman was murmuring words to the wind, performing some kind of ritual that we did not understand. Galves, driven by his curiosity, came too close. I remember how she looked at him directly. Her voice grew louder, and suddenly she stopped murmuring to give him a warning in a language that none of us recognized. Something in her tone did not freeze everyone. Galves, not knowing what to do, tried to retreat, but it was too late. The woman had uttered some words that hung in the air, and Galves was paralyzed for a moment before returning to us as if he had felt something strange. That night, everything began to twist. Galves did not stop scratching his arms and neck. At first, we thought they were insect bites, something common in the desert, but looking closer, we saw that his skin had strange marks, as if it were burned or corroded from the inside. We tried to convince him to go to the nearest base to receive medical attention, but he refused flatly. "I'm fine," he repeated over and over again. But what worried us was not just the physical. Galves was slowly changing, as if something in him was falling apart. He no longer spoke as much as before, and his eyes had lost that curious sparkle that characterized him. Now his gaze was empty, distant, as if he had seen something he could not process. The third day was the worst. We were in a deeper part of the desert where the heat was so unbearable that you felt the sand melt under your feet. That morning, Galves did not get up with the others. We entered his tent and found him shaking, covered in cold sweat, his eyes completely blank. He was writhing on the ground, muttering those same strange words that the old woman had said. At first, we thought he was hallucinating from fever, but there was something else in the way he pronounced those words. It was as if he were repeating a ritual, an invocation that none of us could understand. We took him out of the tent, trying to stay calm while we tried to comfort him. But Galves would not stop muttering, and his voice became more and more cultured, more inhuman. I clearly remember the moment he looked up at me. His eyes that until then were blank now seemed like two deep, bottomless black pits. "She is here," he said in a voice that was not his but something older, something that did not belong to our world. We all stepped back, unable to understand what was happening. That night, we took turns watching him, but no one could really rest. Galves' whispers mixed with the desert wind, creating an unreal atmosphere, as if we were trapped in a nightmare. At some point in the early morning, we realized that Galves had disappeared from his tent. We ran out into the desert, looking for any trace of him under the starlight, but what we found was much worse. He was kneeling in the middle of nowhere, looking at the sky with his arms outstretched, whispering in that strange language but now with more fervor. We slowly approached, and when one of us tried to talk to him, he began to laugh. It was a muffled laugh, as if something was squeezing his throat, and it became louder and louder, echoing in the silence of the desert. It was at that moment when I understood that it was no longer Galves who was in front of us. We tried to hold him, to get him out of that kind of trance, but his eyes looked at us with such deep hatred that I felt a shiver run down my spine. He was lost. At dawn, we found him dead, his body stiff and cold, as if life had escaped him during the night. There was no other option but to bury him there, in the same place where we had found him, far from any settlement, far from any sign of life. It was a desolate place, a corner of the desert that seemed to devour everything it touched. While we tried to sleep that same night, something happened. I felt a presence, something watching us from the darkness. It was as if the old woman herself was watching us from a distance, making sure that her curse had fulfilled its purpose. In the middle of the silence, I heard the sound of footsteps in the sand. But when I got up, there was nothing and no one, just the vast and terrifying desert in its stillness. I didn't talk to anyone about what I had seen or felt. None of us did. It was like we all agreed that the less we mentioned what had happened, the quicker we could forget it. But the next few days weren't any easier. We went back to base, and although we tried to get back to our routine, something had changed. We all knew it, but no one said it out loud. The nights were the worst. I would close my eyes and see Galves again, kneeling in the middle of the desert, laughing with that voice that wasn't his, and always at the end of each dream, I would see the old woman watching me from the shadows with her black eyes. Every time I woke up, I felt her presence closer, as if she were slowly crawling towards me, waiting for the right moment to claim me as she had done with gals. I never talked about it with the others, but I know I wasn't the only one who felt that presence. One by one, all of us who were in that operation began to change. Some left the service. Others fell into depression. I tried to move on, pretending that they were just bad dreams, effects of tension and tiredness. But with time, I realized that there was something more. Now, decades later, I still can't escape that muffled laughter. I hear it every night just before sleeping, like a distant echo that refuses to disappear. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see the old woman waiting for me at the edge of my bed with the same cold smile that I saw in the Sonoran desert. I knew then that the curse had not ended with gals, and although I have tried to flee, the Sonoran desert always finds me, no matter how far away. My name is Francisco Morales. In 1985, I was part of the Venezuelan army on a reconnaissance mission in the swamps of the south of the country. What happened on that mission haunts me to this day. I do not want to remember those moments, but every time I close my eyes at night, I see them, I feel it. What torments me is not so much what happened, but what we could never understand. We had been sent to that area to carry out a reconnaissance. Intelligence reports spoke of suspicious movements near the border, possible insurgent groups, or worse yet, drug traffickers. The swamp was a strategic place for them, a terrain so inhospitable that no one in their right mind would choose it for hiding. But they did it because no one would look for them there, at least until that moment. Our squad was made up of 6 men, each well-trained to move in difficult terrain. We were used to the jungle, to the stifling heat, and the crushing humidity, but the swamp was different. The atmosphere there had something different. It was not only the heat that made you feel as if you were breathing water. It was a pressure, a presence that seemed to surround us since we entered that humid hell. We entered the swamp at dawn. The fog was so dense that we could barely see a few meters in front of us. The muddy ground sucked our boots with each step. Sometimes I couldn't even see my own feet. The vegetation was thick, with twisted trees whose branches looked like deformed hands, searching to catch us. The sounds of the jungle, so familiar to me, felt strange, distorted by the echo of the humidity and the fog. As we advanced, the noise of our own movements became more and more unbearable. The muddy water splashed around us, and each step seemed like an effort, monumental, but there was something else. A silence in the jungle that shouldn't be there. There was no bird songs. There were no insects, just the sound of our breathing and the water moving around us. I remember the exact moment when the real horror began. My partner Santiago was right behind me. He was a strong guy, someone you trusted in a difficult situation. He wasn't the kind of person who got scared easily. However, that day, something was disturbing him, something I couldn't explain. I saw him nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. At some point, he stopped talking and just kept going in silence. Suddenly, as we walked into a deeper section of the swamp, I heard a splash behind me, as if something had moved quickly in the water. I turned instinctively, but Santiago was no longer there. I heard no scream, no noise, nothing, just silence. I looked at my other companions, and they all had the same bewildered expression. We walked back a few meters, looking for any sign of him. It was then when we saw his helmet floating on the surface of the water, rocking slightly with the small waves that we made as we moved. I picked it up with shaking hands, and when I picked it up, the dirty, dark water was dripping down the edges. It was as if he had simply disappeared, swallowed by the swamp. But the worst was what we saw in the mud next to where the helmet floated. There were footprints, not the footprints of an adult man, but marks of small hands, like those of a child, printed in the wet mud. They were fresh, as if something or someone had been there just a few minutes ago. Nobody said anything. We looked at each other, looking for answers that none of us had. We tried to keep our composure and continue the search, but something in the environment had changed. The air was heavier, more suffocating, as if the swamp itself knew what had just happened and was stalking us. We continued forward, but our morale was broken. Our steps were clumsy, mechanical, without the energy of before. We no longer spoke. We knew that something was wrong, but none of us wanted to admit it. As we moved forward, the fog grew thicker, to the point that we could barely see the man in front of us. It was then that the murmurs began. I don't know how to describe it better. At first, I thought they were the others' voices, maybe a whispered conversation. But when I turned around, I saw that everyone was silent, and yet the murmurs continued, just at the edge of my hearing, as if someone was speaking from the fog, too low to understand what they were saying. We tried to ignore it, to keep going, but the murmurs became clearer, incomprehensible words, as if they were in an ancient language or a tongue that none of us knew. Sometimes it seemed as if they were coming from everywhere at once, surrounding us, watching us. Other times, the sounds felt distant, as if they were calling us from somewhere deep in the swamp. My companions heard them too. I saw it in their eyes. Fear was present in each one of us, but military training pushed us forward. Although we knew deep down that something beyond our understanding awaited us, we continued. I can't say how much time passed since Santiago disappeared. Time in that place seemed to stretch and distort, as if the swamp did not respect the rules of the outside world. Somehow we reached a more open area, a clearing surrounded by twisted, moss-covered trees. The fog had cleared a little, but there was something else, something that wasn't there before. We saw figures, shadows moving through the trees. At first, I thought they were the insurgents we had finally found what we were looking for. But as the figures moved, we realized they weren't people. They were something more. The shadows were thin, misshapen, with arms and legs that seemed to lengthen and twist in impossible ways. They moved quickly through the trees, too fast to be human. But the scariest thing was the feeling they conveyed. They weren't there to run away from us. They weren't trying to hide. They weren't watching, as if they were waiting for something. My companions began to murmur among themselves, arguing whether we should retreat or continue. But before we could make a decision, one of the shadows stopped, and then we saw it. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a figure, a human figure, or something that once was. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its sunken and empty eyes seemed to pierce the soul of whoever looked. It was the height of a child, but there was something deeply unnatural in its appearance, as if its body had been deformed by time or pain. In its hand, it was holding something. When it raised its arm, I recognized what it was: Santiago's helmet. He had had it on all this time. I don't know what happened next with clarity. Panic took hold of us. One of my companions opened fire, and at that moment, everything fell apart. The sound of gunshots echoed in the fog, but the shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they began to approach, moving through the trees, surrounding us. I felt an intense cold in the air, and something in me knew we couldn't stay there. We shouted confused orders, trying to regroup, but everything was chaos. At some point, one of my companions stumbled and fell into the water. We tried to help him, but the fog closed in around us, and we lost sight of him. The last thing we heard was his scream, a heartbreaking sound that still haunts me. We ran. I don't know how we managed to get out of that swamp, but at some point, the fog began to dissipate, and the muddy ground gave way to firmer ground. There were only 3 of us when we finally got out of the swamp, soaked, exhausted, and silently. No one said a word about what we had seen. It was not necessary. When we returned to base, we gave our report. We said that we had found signs of enemy activity, but that we had lost 3 men due to the difficult conditions of the terrain. Nobody asked us more. Nobody wanted to know the truth. Since then, I have not returned to that place, but something tells me that I have never really left. The nights are the worst. I close my eyes, and I see Santiago. I see the shadows. I see those empty eyes looking at me from the fog. And the worst of all is that I know that they are waiting for me to return. But I will not. I will not return.